Hi there. Today we're going to talk about, continue talking about police issues and challenges and legal aspects. So, Chapter 8 talks about the police and the public and what it is that the police are to do on behalf of the public as public servants. So, to carry out the duties of law enforcement, order maintenance, service, and information gathering successfully, the police must have the trust and cooperation of the public. The manner in which they carry out those functions determines the community respect for and trust in the police. And there's a lot of slides there about public opinion in the police. It ebbs and flows. You will probably see things in the media today about police shootings, police brutalities. You know, we see them a lot because we're in a 24/7 news cycle, and the access to information is at a much higher rate today than ever before. Having said that, the ability to be able to videotape officers is allows for insight that we might never have seen before. So you'll be able to look at some slides about police and public opinion. And I'm going to go talk through police recruitment and selection. So ideally, we want police departments to hire those officers that the community wants, and what they want is, what's important to their community, as the people that they choose clearly have a long-standing impact for the community. Motivation for a police career, normal self-assertiveness, emotional stability under stress. As you can imagine, being a police officer is highly stressful. Sensitivity towards minority groups and social deviance. And towards that level, for years and decades now, police have been trying their best to have resources in place to be able to hire individuals that typically would not want to become a police officer but would represent the community. So those would be individuals that are often non-Caucasian and non-males. And then also to have another quality would be collaborative leadership skills, to be flexible, to be mature, all of that characteristics that you would imagine for individuals that deal with the general public not on their best day. And then there's been some research to say that important qualities are known as the 3 I's: intelligence, integrity, and interaction, and common sense and clearly compassion for individuals. The average level of education in policing is nearly 2 years of college. However, a lot of really big urban placements, such as CMPD, would require a 4-year degree or military service. So it's not that it's required, but it is preferred. And when it is so competitive, it definitely bodes well for you to have the most at what folks would want, type of education folks would want you to have. And so why does it matter what kind of education our police officers have? Well, because they can write reports, so they can be able to communicate. That's why a lot of times they don't want you right outside of high school, because they want you to be mature and have some life experiences. They want you to be able to use discretion, which we'll talk about later on. And, with age often comes wisdom. So some of the issues in policing that we'll talk about today are discretion, stress, use of force, police corruption, and then also professionalizing law enforcement. I'm really just going to touch on them because the other slides will go into more detail. So discretion is super important throughout the entire criminal justice system, but since the police are the gatekeepers of the system, it's very, very important that the police, as the front, the gatekeepers, that they're able to use their discretion wisely. The reality is, discretion is needed. I'm going to repeat that because it's super important. Discretion's needed. So we need officers, well-trained officers, to have good use of discretion, well-trained prosecutors to have good use of discretion, well-trained correctional officers to have good use of discretion. So it is something that we have to have in our system. When we're looking at police, we need to make sure that they are using their discretion effectively, so that if they're not, then it can result in selective enforcement, discrimination, violence, and abuse. And so when we're talking about discretion, we're saying, well, we could have policies and procedures that guide officers, but it's not every single time. So they have to have this innate sense of what does their agency want, what does a reasonable person expect, and that for them to be able to routinely use their own discretion and making sure that that individual judgment that they're using is based on good, solid grounds. So patrol officers routinely use their discretion in deciding, number one, where to patrol when not answering radio calls, whom to stop and question, which traffic violators to chase, and whether to ignore a minor violation in pursuit of something more serious. So think back to your own experience with law enforcement. Has there ever been a time when police have stopped you and used their discretion to let you go when maybe they could have written you up for out-of-date tags, a broken taillight, speeding, things like that? So that's all police discretion. Well, if we have full enforcement, that's saying that every statute in all criminal codes, that's full enforcement. Well, the reality is it's often cumbersome. So selective enforcement is that the officers choose which laws to enforce because their job requires them to enforce all the laws. And so when we say, well, factors affecting the police discretion, so policies, practices, norms, and customs of your police department, size of the police department, supervisor span of control. So how much do supervisors check in with you? Are you allowed to have unfettered discretion, which means no one's checking in, that you can run rampant? Or does your supervisor have a decent chain of command and they have a good idea of what you're doing and when you're letting people go and when you're not? What are the neighborhood, socioeconomic status of neighborhood, the crime rate, right? So criminal victim variables. So who are of the people, so for a lot of domestic calls, relational distance is, is this police call for service, is this on a husband and wife, an estranged, child and mother, preference of the complainant. So do they want to have the officer not file a complaint? Socioeconomic status. So often folks that are in wealthier neighborhoods might be able to get away with more discretion because maybe they can say to the officer, don't worry about arresting Johnny. I'll go ahead and make sure that he gets mental health or something like that. And that officer's like, okay, all right, it's my discretion, that low-level offense. I'll go ahead and let you take care of it. Is it legal? It's an extra legal factor that they're using to be able to say, well, I'm going to use my discretion because I'm going to believe that parent is going to be able to get services. Is it unfair because when you go to an under-resourced or lower resource community, they don't have that option to be able to get that child some services? Yeah, some would say for sure. Race, so sometimes a race of the opposite of the police officer. So are they more or less likely to use discretion for folks that look like them or don't look like them? And then also age. And then situational, which would be the seriousness of the crime. So the demeanor of the suspect. I can't tell you how important it is for you to have a decent demeanor when you're dealing with police, no matter what. Low level, high level, always be deferential, be respectful, because the police can use their discretion for good or for bad. So if you start up why are you stopping me, and, tough guy and tough gal, then the reality is they could take that further. Visibility of the encounter. So did other folks see it? Does the police now have to gather additional evidence? Were there other eyes on it, or is it just his word to be able to deal with the complainants? So like I said before, discretion in domestic violence. The police don't love being able to answer domestic violence. Often it is highly volatile for the victim and the alleged offender, as well as the criminal justice practitioner that comes in for that call. So they're dangerous. It's tense and often hostile. The police oftentimes conduct an investigation, and the victim will, not always, but will maybe later drop the charges. And in fact, a lot of times the victim simply wants the violence to stop, doesn't necessarily want the defendant to actually be arrested, just doesn't want to have any more violence against them. An arrest might further harm the family, might exacerbate a family crisis, might cost money. So if the police are arresting somebody for domestic, and that same household is going to have to bail that individual out of jail, or that individual might be the primary wage earner, and now they're arrested, and now they can't necessarily be earning wages. And so the police, it depends domestic violence certainly come a long way in the last 4 decades, but like for example, Charlotte is under preferred arrest. So it's preferred once there's a call for service that the officers of CMPD make an arrest. They have to figure out who's the primary aggressor, and they have to figure out and then be able to bring them back. So some cases have some agencies, jurisdictions have mandatory, some's preferred, and some it's really left 100% up to the discretion of the officer. So police are required to intervene if crimes are committed. So mediating the dispute, separating, arresting the perpetrator. A lot of times, if there's no agency rule or regulation, then it's up to the discretion of that officer to figure out who's the primary aggressor and then to figure out what to do with such. So discretion and racial profiling. If you hear a lot of use of discretion, often it is because of racial profiling. It's a growing concern to law enforcement and clearly to the public. Often stops are justified by minor equipment or moving traffic violations that might be ignored. So, a back light, or a tail light's out, or not coming to a complete stop, having a rolling stop. At the root of the practice is racial profiling, the stopping or detaining of individuals by law enforcement that are based solely on race. So this is called driving while black, and the idea really started in New Jersey. And the chief of police in New Jersey, African-American chief of police, essentially told his officers that you need to stop certain types of cars that are highly likely to be driven by African-American folks, because the likelihood is that they would have drugs on them. It was unfounded, and a lot of research came out from that. So the idea about racial profiling based on a certain car, based on a certain race, and that sort of thing. So discretion, while needed, it's one of those really double-edged swords. We need it because the process of people that we deal with in the system, but it has to be used for good. So there's 5 basic values of police subculture. Number 1, only a police can understand the true nature of the police work. The courts have placed too many restrictions on the police to be able to fight crime. Loyalty is the highest virtue among police officers. The public are fickle. It comes, ebbs and flows. And the police officer is the only real crime fighter. And when we talk a lot about the different subcultures, I'm just going to briefly talk on some of them, but all of these slides are super important. So the working personality, be able to have norms of loyalty, perceptions of danger, use of authority, and suspicion. Police personality also emerges from aspects of the job. Danger, they have a lot of isolation and authority. They recognizable characteristics can often be conservative, authoritarian, often cynical because of all what they see, suspicious, again, of what they see, hostile, and then also individualistic. And so, is it that folks self-select to become a police officer because the nature of the work attracts those that are by nature cynical, authoritarian, and secretive? Or is it that the process of being socialized in the job of a police person actually causes these traits to develop? So there's evidence to suggest both. And police solidarity, this concept of the thin blue curtain or the thin blue line, that it's secretive, it's isolated. Police culture isolates officers from the rest of society. And over here on this other side, they have to deal with secrecy because they're bound by laws. They have isolation from others because of things that they might be privy to that they can't potentially talk to with their neighbors, their spouses, their friends. And so this police solidarity, the shift work causes a lot of problems because sometimes they're working, a 12-hour shift that starts at 11 o'clock at night. Well, if they do that enough, they limit their social ability. Hostile public is a problem, and then dependability. So these are all reasons why police might be more insular, and a lot of times police often marry within law enforcement and have friends within law enforcement so that those individuals really understand the police work. Copside is a phenomenon that affects some officers. Copside is also called suicide by cop. It's a form of suicide in which a person purposely or deliberately gets fatally shot after intentionally provoking law enforcement officers. It doesn't happen often, but the idea about suicide by a cop, when it happens, does tend to make the news, which maybe makes people think that it happens more than it actually does. So like I said, cynicism is the idea that most people's actions are motivated solely by personal needs and selfishness. And research was done a while ago in 1967 that showed really around year 7 is when people's cynicism on the job. So a lot of times what we do today is we start retraining officers around year 7, 8, 9, and 10 to make sure that they don't become so cynical and feel so isolated. So use of force is another issue that we have to deal with law enforcement. By law, they have the right to use force if necessary to make an arrest, to keep the peace or to maintain order, but just how much force and under what circumstances really is complex. Graham versus Connor in 1989 said that force is excessive when considering all the circumstances known to the officer at the time that they acted. And so that idea about at the time that they acted is we're not talking about a reasonable person. We're talking about a trained intellect individual that in their profession of their job had made a split-second decision. And so the idea was that, in fact, use of force. And so excessive use of force is just that police can use the same evidence or just above the same type of force commensurate to be able to get somebody in line. So it becomes excessive when it's beyond that necessary ability to be able to match force. And so you'll see here that force must be commensurate. So, force used to resist has to be able to attach to force that was used to arrest. And so the idea is, first just mere persuasion. A police officer rolling up might stop people from doing what they're doing, might get somebody's attention. Now, maybe a police is like, hey, how's it going? Be able to talk to them. And then the voice commands, you need to stop. And then firm grips, placing hands on them, pain compliance. So these are techniques used in law enforcement to make sure that folks are able to get commensurate with their pain, impact devices and techniques, and then deadly use of force. Clearly that is the highest, right? And so when we talk about use of force findings, it doesn't happen often. So a lot of times the public thinks that use of force is often happen. It doesn't happen all that often, but when it does happen, we do hear a lot of information about it. And then high-speed police pursuits, is it lethal? Should they use a car to chase after you, especially if it's not especially if maybe it was something minor, right? So is it necessary? Because what happens when police pursuits is other people might get in the way of the intersection and then cause people to actually have other things happen. So deadly force, Tennessee versus Gardner, when the suspect poses no imminent threat, that operative word is imminent threat to the officer, they cannot use deadly force. However, the use of deadly force is not justifiable unless the arrest is for a felony, the person effecting the arrest is authorized to do so as a police officer or law enforcement, and they believe that there was nothing else that they could have done. And imminent danger is that just the fact that they believe that their lives were in imminent danger, and that's why they had to use deadly force. So we talk about police brutality, abusive language, making threats, physical force, use of a nightstick, stop and search harassment. These are things that the willful and wrongful use of force by police officers who knowingly exceed would be called police brutality. And then, probably the most researched is the Knapp Commission in 1972, and your book talks a lot about the grass eaters versus the meat eaters, and really knowing the difference between, the meat eaters are aggressive, or the grass eaters are those low level that accept payoffs for their everyday duties. So they're not, trying to find reasons and expectations to be able to get payoff. It's more like, kickbacks and things like that. These are some common forms of corruption we see within law enforcement: meals and services given, opportunistic theft. If maybe, there's picked up for weed, or there's money to be able to take that money or take some of that money. Protection of illegal activities. So gambling. So maybe an officer knows that gambling's happening. They look the other way. They get a kickback for that. Favoritism, again, private security. And that's why a lot of times that they no longer want the police officers in donut shops or in specific shops. Now the shop owners are like, yes, we'd love you to come here because we have a presence. legislatively, they believe then that the officers are getting kickbacks from that shop, or that sort of thing, so they're worried about that a lot. And then corruption individuals, so is it individuals, is it a rotten apple, is it a rotten barrel? So is it something that is top down, or is it just a couple that a couple rogue police officers? Some way to control it is making sure that they have high moral standards, police policies and discipline, make sure that they have a uniform enforcement of the law, outside review and special prosecutors, and really what we've seen is the internal affairs investigation. So this is the police unit that allows to determine if illegal activity has been done and to address any unethical activity. Changing police corruption, this is early warning system, so making sure your chain of command is on you, making sure that they understand what you're doing. On the front end, selection and recruiting, educating the public, and as well as the police on what is corrupt and what they won't stand for, and then having these investigative units and increasing the severity of discipline if it's been found that in fact they were corrupt.